Hey guys, welcome back to Pokemon TCG Pocked. In today's video, we're going to be going through the results from another tournament that was held over the weekend with the Pocket Legends League, which is a community-based, basically competitive league that gets run through Discord. I'll leave a link to it in the description if you want to get around it. But they do these tournaments, and it's great to have a look at the decks. Now, we'll go through the winning decks, which massive shout out to Nothing But Bangers, who is actually another content creator, and I will leave a link to his video in the description. I haven't watched it, so I can have my own thoughts about his deck, and then if you guys want to check out his view on it, you can go ahead and check out that video. But the most interesting thing that I also want to discuss in here is what is looking to be the most popular deck for people to choose going into these tournaments now, which is the Mewtwo EX deck, compared to what has previously been the Pikachu EX and Starmie EX as being seen as the top of the meta. So I want to talk about my thoughts around that as well, go through the whole tournament and go through the top 8 decks that we saw in it. So let's jump into it. So first of all, this was the submission of players that tried to get into it. This is from 161 decks submitted. This gives you the breakdown of how many chose each deck. And as you can see, Mewtwo EX taking up the big chunk. Now, they have separated Pikachu EX and Pikachu EX with Lieutenant Surge. I think they just both fall into the same category. The Raichu tech and Surge tech is to basically have an out against those big walls that Pikachu EX otherwise struggles with, kind of like the grass decks and stuff like that. So I do consider them the same thing. So this would be about 22.5% Pikachu EX and 27.8% Mewtwo EX, and you can see the other things rotating around that. Now, previously we saw a ton of Pikachu, and that drives the Starmie and Articuno ones down because they are a pretty hard counter, but we'll talk about Mewtwo in a sec. But then we look at the top 16, the top cut, we ended up with Mewtwo really dominating in this area. You can see 7 there and only 4 Pikachu decks in there, being the 3 normal Pika EX and 1 with the Surge. And then we've got 1 of these other decks. So that was very interesting to see as well how many Mewtwo actually got. Obviously, it had a large majority here, but the amount that actually got through to this. Now, I'm just going to jump over to the first Mewtwo deck that we had, which was by Drake. Massive shout out to him for coming second with this deck. But I want to use this to talk about it, and then we'll go ahead and talk about the other decks. Because the thing about Mewtwo EX is its consistencies that are seeing people use it a lot more. Now, me personally, I'm not a massive fan of the Mewtwo EX. I play a lot of random decks, and it's actually a really good matchup for me with a lot of the random decks that I play. But in general, against the current meta, the thing about Mewtwo that I find makes it so popular and consistent is that it has a relatively high floor. And by that, I mean, if you get an average hand, you can still perform really well because all you really need in your hand is that Mewtwo EX. And then you can load up the 2 energy. You can start swinging for 50 damage. Maybe you bring a Giovanni in there so you can kill some key basics. But past that, it gives you time and a thick wall to be able to build up the rest of your bench, hopefully set up a Gardevoir, and then away you go. But it's because that Mewtwo adds pressure. Like when we look at this compared to, say, a Charizard EX deck, which I think there was one here. Yeah, so when we look at it compared to a Charizard EX deck, Charizard, you need to start with the Moltres. Otherwise, you're kind of boned. And then you also need to have the Charmander on the bench so you can start loading it up straight away. Whereas something like the Mewtwo deck, you can just have a Mewtwo and then you can worry about getting the other stuff later. And then the Gardevoir is kind of like a win more solution for it as opposed to must use win condition. Whereas in something like a Charizard, which is the other sort of setup deck that we're looking at, you need all those pieces and you need to get them relatively quickly. So this is more prone to bricking, whereas Mewtwo just has more good hands. Having said that, the ceiling of Mewtwo is not as high as something like Charizard, because once you set up a Charizard, there's just like no beating it unless you cheese around it with Sabrina's. Like a setup Charizard with 5 energies coming in to swing is just going to win you the game. Whereas the Mewtwo can still be played around and beaten. But like I said, when we look at this versus things like the Pikachu EX and the Starmie EX, the good thing about Mewtwo, to be able to start putting out really heavy pressure, all you need is the Mewtwo on board. Now, it is only going to have a 2 energy 50 damage pressure, but you got to remember with Pikachu and also with Starmie, Pikachu, you need the 3 bench. Starmie, you need to have the evolution, or you're running the Articuno, and with Articuno, you're kind of relying on Misty Flips. Otherwise, Articuno is a little bit slow. Once again, it does ramp up pretty decently, but the whole thing behind this Mewtwo deck is essentially that it has a really decent setup once you get the Gardevoir and stuff set up as well, but it also has decent pressure and consistencies because of just the Mewtwo itself. So I'm curious to see what you guys think. I still personally prefer Starmie and Pikachu decks overall, but I do think the Mewtwo is a good deck. It's just not one of my personal preferred decks. I've played it a fair bit, but I don't know. I just wish there was a bit more to it. It's just not my playstyle, but definitely showing to be a very consistent and popular deck based on what we're seeing with people who are trying to play competitively in these entries. And now we're going to deep dive through all the decks, but before we do that, I just want to give a quick TLDR on who played the decks because I forgot to name them all as I went through it. So once again, nothing but bangers in P1. We've got Drake with P2. We got Zokram with P3. We got I with P4. Spore Venom Sick Name with P5. Then we have Elwood here in 6th place. Then we have Hanji, I believe that's how we say it, in 7th. And also Raggett in P8. This is a really cool play for me. The thing about Venusaur I find is that it's kind of awkward as a setup deck. Where if you're evenly matched on sort of like hand RNG and stuff like that, I feel like the setup of the Charizard beats it. The setup of Mewtwo beats it normally. Like obviously there will be situations where it doesn't, but I feel like its matchup isn't as strong if you evened it out over a lot of battles over who would win. But it is a very good matchup for Starmie. It is a very good matchup for Pikachu as well. And that's a really cool thing about it. Now, there's a few interesting things in this deck that I absolutely love because I love the fact that he's run the double normal Executor and only one Executor EX. Now, the thing with Executor EX, it can clutch you really like easy wins, like from like cheesy positions. You know, you get it out, like you go first, they don't set up a bench. You go turn 2, you flip a heads and you delete their basic and you win. Like it can do those things. To be fair though, normal Executor can do that against 60 HP basics as well. But the thing I love about the 2 normal Executor here is that my problem in Venusaur decks with the Executor EX is that if you say early on you don't start well, maybe you lose a Bulbasaur or an execute early. Then if you put a benched Executor, it just leaves you room to get trapped with that Executor in there because it only needs 1 energy. You need a ton of energy on your Venusaur. That's where all your energy need to go. And it's really hard to retreat this thing with a 3 retreat cost. So that's where it's kind of awkward. And if this thing gets beaten early as well, the other aspect is, so say you go Executor EX early, the opponent KOs that Executor EX. You're trying to set up your Venusaur. If they just Sabrina you into something else and then snipe you for 1 point, you lose the game, which is kind of like, obviously every deck has that issue, but that's why I prefer the normal Executor, because if they beat that early, they've still got to get those 2 points. And what are the 2 things they're going to have to kill in this deck to get those 2 points? It's either going to be another Executor and a basic, or a Venusaur, or if you do play the Executor EX, that one. But once again, if they kill the Executor, the normal one, it's too hard to just clutch a win out of the situation. So I am a massive fan of the normal Executor over the EX, because if they get that, they're either going to have to like try and beat down your Venusaur, which is a tough thing, or go for 2 more basic kills, which is a lot harder to do. So massive respect to this one. I love the double Executor in there. I don't know how his matches went or anything like that, because you got to remember with the Executor, it still does have 130 HP as a wall, plus bringing pressure of 30 to 60 damage. That is a really, really solid wall in my opinion. And you have the added addition of in this deck of Erica being able to top it off and make it really frustrating to kill. So once again, massive shout out. Love this deck, really cool one. Moving on to that, this one was the Mewtwo deck that we saw in there. Basically, this is a pretty staple Mewtwo deck. I personally find the most consistent is just the 2 Mewtwo's, 2 Ralts lines. Job done. Now, the things you can change around in here, in my opinion, from the trainers, like this is a very staple lineup. But I think the ones that you can flex around numbers on is Potion. Giovanni, you kind of really want 2 in this deck, just because it gets that 50 damage up to a 60, which can clutch a lot of kills. So I think seeing Giovanni is really nice. But I think Potion, Red Card, and Sabrina are the ones you can flex the numbers around. I think the double XP, double Pokeball, double Oak, and double Giovanni are pretty staple in it. But in general, this is just a pretty solid Mewtwo all-round deck. Moving on from that, I love seeing anything with the Marowak and the Sandslash. I always say Sandslash is a fantastic deck, just a fantastic card, sorry. Being a stage 2 cost, 70 damage, and the key 100 HP is super nice. They're running the double Farfetch'd in this one, so this deck is all around having early pressure and putting that pressure on the opponent. I really like this deck in general. You've got the idea behind this one to me is to get pressure on early with Farfetch'd and Sandslash, then you're leaving the Marowak EX in the back to come in to try and clutch a win from an unwinnable position. That's the way I normally play it personally. Running the double Giovanni, double Sabrina, and double Oak is pretty staple. 1x speed, 1 potion. You can probably flex around some of those numbers, but in general, I think it's a really, really solid deck. Maybe I'm curious to see, maybe I'd drop 1 Farfetch'd for an extra X speed, maybe to have the flex of plays, but I think all around, this is a pretty solid deck, and I do love seeing these decks. I just think they're a lot of fun, and just a really cool, like, free-to-play viable deck. Like, if you start with the starter deck where you get the Marowak EX, you can always throw in 1 Marowak EX, 1 normal Marowak, and you're cooking with this deck. I think it's a lot of fun. This one was another Mewtwo EX deck. This one opting for the Meowth over and only the 1 Giovanni. And that's kind of what we're looking at. Once again, pretty staple. I'm not a fan of Meowth in a lot of things. I just find it never works for me unless you're coming up against something like a Charizard that has the Moltres sitting in there and you can fill your hand completely up. But having said that, everything runs red card at the moment. Everyone's running at least 1 red card, and it can just ruin your day and make it feel so pointless. But once again, solid deck all around. Mewtwo very consistent. Charizard, honestly, for me, Charizard's the deck I probably play the most because I'm trying to level up my free-to-play account, and I've got the full Charizard deck with the double Crown Rare, which it's quite satisfying to play. So this is the one I have the most experience with. I've tried so many variations of Charizard, and this is literally, to me, the build for Charizard. There's nothing else I'd really go for. This build on Charizard is just super steady. I tried it with Giovanni's. I just find I never need a Giovanni. The only other thing I have tried teching is instead of 1 red card, running 1 of the scope, because sometimes seeing your opponent's hand and knowing if they can Sabrina you is kind of handy. Just because Sabrina is like the biggest issue for a Charizard deck, because if you don't get 2 Moltres on board and be able to swap between them, then you're just basically bait to Sabrina after your Moltres dies. And then early on in the battle as a Charizard, if you got Moltres up top and then you got Charmander down back getting the energy, early game, you want to have a bench filled up so that if they Sabrina you, you can bring something up and your beefed up Charmander, which is getting the energies, doesn't die. However, after your Moltres dies, you want nothing else on the bench because you just want to bring your Charizard up and not be a risk of losing a game to a Sabrina. So Charizard does have the biggest issue with Sabrinas, in my opinion, and that's where sometimes using that the lens, the scope, whatever it's called, where you get to see your opponent's hand, can be a nice little tech to know if they have that Sabrina and if you can play around it. Keeping in mind that they can always draw into it, but I think the double red card is the best build, and this is the build I currently run. I think it's fantastic. One issue with Charizard is always that it is more prone to getting bricked hands and losing just due to not having as good of a hand, because with Charizard, if you don't get the good hand, you're kind of boned. Like, there's nothing you're doing about it. Just stiff. Unlike the Mewtwo, like we mentioned earlier. Moving on from that, this one is going to be the Pikachu EX with the Raichu Surge tech. Once again, I think this is a solid play in the current meta, because I do like the Electrode build for general play, but I think if you're coming up against a bunch of Mewtwo's and stuff, then the Raichu is a play. But you do need to have that bit of chip damage into the enemy Mewtwo, which is the awkward thing as well, because it is only doing the 140, not the 150. But normally you do have chip damage into a Mewtwo because they do normally leave it up the front at the start. So I do think this is a really solid deck as well in the current meta. Not too much to put onto it. Sometimes some people want to run more basics, 7 to 8 basics, but I think this is pretty solid. And I'm assuming this would be very consistent anyway. But yeah, like I said, I normally play a deck closer to this one here, which is the one with the electrodes in it. This one, though, has the interesting tech of the normal Zapdos. I'm assuming what this is giving it another 1-point sacrificial lamb to be able to pump out. I'm assuming like it's just to put the Zapdos out there as a 100 HP wall that can live through other Pikas and Starmies and then let you generate your energy on the Pika in the back, then retreat for 1 cost and come back. And if it does die, it's only 1 point, meaning you can sacrifice another Electrode or Voltold later on and then bring out the Pika EX. That would be my assumptions, but I'm not 100% sure on how that one worked. And the final deck we have in here is going to be the Blaine aggro deck. I've been playing this deck a lot over the last couple of days because I finally got my second Blaine on my free-to-play account. So I'm like, all right, let's run some Blaine. I really do like this deck. I don't play the Magmar personally. I do see the value in doing a Magmar. But I find the cool thing about this deck is it's kind of like, you know, you set up one energy on a couple of like if you get like 2 Vulpix / Ninetales with 1 energy on them, nothing needs energy anymore because the next turn when you bring whatever you're going to bring, you just place that energy and attack. It's like, it's super energy efficient and satisfying to play this deck. I don't know. I find it to be absolutely amazing. The other thing is we have access to the Vulpix, which can be super clutch at shutting down setup decks, specifically Charizard. Like, you put this thing up against the Moltres can't attack. They can't do anything, and it's so frustrating. So I do like this deck. You've got, if you go first and you set up a Ponyta, go to Rapidash, then you've got 40 damage plus 30 with Blaine. You got a 70 damage beat stick on turn 2 to knock out just about any basic in the game. I think that's pretty solid. But yeah, this is a really fun deck. Glad to see that it got up here into the top 8. And that does round up our top 8. So once again, I've been having fun looking at the results from these tournaments. Haven't been able to play in one just because of the timing. They're at like 11 p.m. on a Sunday night for me, which is just absolutely cooks me. But these have been absolutely fun. It's good to see what people are trying to compete with. Like I said, Mewtwo really ramping up there. And once again, massive shout out to Nothing But Bangers for this deck in here, getting the win with the Venusaur EX deck. But as always, guys, thanks for watching. Hope you have an awesome day, and I look forward to seeing the next one. Cheers.